The prairie wind carried with it the smell of dry grass and dust, sweeping across the open plains like a restless spirit. The horizon stretched endlessly, broken only by the wooden fences and weather-worn cabins of a small frontier village. It was the late 1800s, and life out here was nothing short of harsh. Every day was a test of strength, patience, and courage. People worked the land with rough hands and hopeful hearts, knowing tomorrow was never promised. Drought, hunger, and danger walked as constant companions, but so did faith and determination. On one such day, the stillness of the prairie was shattered by the thundering hooves of cattle. Their cries cut through the air, sharp and wild, echoing off the wooden corrals where a herd had broken loose. Dust swirled as the beasts stampeded, their dark bodies charging across the sun-bleached grass. Amid the chaos, one figure stood out. Against the fence, bound tightly with ropes, was an Apache warrior. His wrists and chest were lashed cruelly. To the rough-hewn posts, the rope biting deep into his skin. He did not cry out, though his dark eyes burned with both anger and defiance. His chest rose and fell steadily, the calm of a man who had endured worse. Yet even a man as strong as he could not fight off a charging bull. From across the field, a young woman saw it. She was heavy with child, her apron brushing against her knees as she stumbled toward the corral. The wind caught her hair, whipping. It loosed from its braid as fear and determination pushed her forward. Her heart pounded not only for herself, but for the life she carried inside her. Each step was an act of defiance against her own frailty. She had no reason to risk everything. For him, an Apache, someone most of the village saw as an enemy. But in her heart, she felt something stronger than fear or prejudice. Perhaps it was compassion. Perhaps it was instinct. But she could not stand by and watch another soul be trampled to death. The bull lowered its head, its horns glinting in the fading sunlight as it barreled toward the helpless man. The ground shook beneath its charge, every hoof beat like a drumbeat of fate. Dust rose in clouds, and the smell of sweat and fear hung heavy in the air. The Apache's eyes flickered once toward the woman running toward him. He could not understand why she came, nor why she would risk her life for him. But in that fleeting moment, he saw something he had long forgotten existed, a stranger's mercy. The woman's breath came sharp and ragged as she pushed forward, her shoes slipping in the dirt. Voices behind her called out, distant and panicked, warning her to stop. She ignored them. The pounding of hooves was too close now. She had seconds, maybe less. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the rope. The coarse fibers scraped against her palms as she pulled, but the knots were cruelly tied, hardened by sweat and dirt. The Apache jerked his arms, straining against the binds, but the rope only cut deeper. The bull was almost upon them now, its breath hot and heavy, eyes red with rage. Her mind screamed at her to run, to protect her child, to save herself. Yet her heart screamed louder. With a final desperate tug, she pulled at the knot, the fibers loosening just enough for one wrist to come free. The Apache let out a sharp breath, his strength surging as he tore against the fence, snapping the sewn, weakened ties. But it was too late. The bull was only feet away. The woman stumbled back, the ground tilting beneath her. The beast's horns caught the sunlight, casting long shadows across the earth. The air seemed to hold still for one impossible heartbeat. Dust hung like smoke. The Apache's body twisted, half free, his muscles straining against the last binds. The woman's hands shook, her lips parted as though in prayer. And the bull charged, its massive body filling the narrow space between life and death. The sound that followed was a roar, a clash of nature and fate colliding all at once. But whether it was the snap of rope, the cry of the bull, or the woman's gasp of fear, it was impossible to tell. The prairie swallowed the noise, leaving only silence and dust in its wake. And in that silence hung a question as sharp as the horns of the beast. Had she saved him or doomed them both? The dust still lingered in the air as though the land itself was holding its breath. The bull's charge had thrown everything into chaos, and yet for a brief moment the world stood frozen. The Apache's chest heaved as he yanked his last arm free, rope fraying against the wood until it snapped loose. The woman stumbled back, clutching her swollen belly, her eyes wide with both fear and stubborn determination. The bull lunged past. The fence, grazing its horn against the post where the Apache had been bound only seconds before. Splinters flew, the wood groaned, and the earth shuddered beneath its weight. She fell to her knees, breathless, as the bull wheeled around for another attack. The Apache, now half free but still tangled with rope around his torso, lunged forward with desperate strength. He did not run from the beast but toward it, his hand grasping at the loose post he had been tied to. With a fierce cry, he yanked it free, the wood breaking from the earth with a rough crack. He swung it clumsily but with the full force of a man who had known battle, driving the beast back for a moment. The bull bellowed, furious, pawing the ground and lowering its head again. The woman pressed a hand to her chest, gasping for air. She had not thought beyond this moment. She only knew she could not watch him die. Behind her, voices grew louder, men rushing from the cabins, shotguns raised and shouts filling the air. Yet they were too far. The fight here belonged to the trapped Apache, the bull, and the woman caught between them. The bull lunged once more. The Apache twisted aside, the post striking its shoulder, but the force sent him stumbling. The woman, still kneeling in the dirt, reached for the rope tangled around him. Her fingers worked frantically, pulling and clawing until the last knot gave way. The Apache staggered free just as the bull's horn sliced the space where he had stood. He caught the woman by the arm, yanking her to her feet, and for a heartbeat their eyes met. His were sharp, unyielding, carrying the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Hers were wide, fearful, yet filled with something stronger than fear. The sound of gunfire cracked the air, startling the bull into retreat. It snorted angrily, pacing before it turned and galloped back toward the open plains. Dust swallowed its retreat, leaving silence behind once again. The men from the village arrived only then, weapons still raised, their eyes darting between the Apache and the young woman. "Get back!" One shouted, his voice raw with authority. "Step away from him." The Apache stood tall, though his body carried bruises from the ropes and the near collision with the beast. His chest rose with heavy breaths, but he did not flinch. He did not run. He only stood, watching them with the eyes of someone who had long ago learned not to beg for mercy. The woman, still trembling, moved instinctively in front of him, her hands spread as if she could shield him from both the men and their judgment. The air was thick with tension. No one spoke, not at first. The men's faces hardened with confusion and anger. Why would she risk her life and her unborn child for someone they saw as an enemy? The silence was broken only by the caw of a crow circling overhead as if the land itself waited for someone to make the next move. Days later, whispers filled the village. The story of the woman who had run into the path of a bull to save an Apache spread like wildfire. Some called it madness. Others called it sin. A few, though very few, called it courage. She could feel their stares as she walked the narrow dirt paths between cabins, her hands resting protectively on her belly. The questions followed her everywhere, though few dared speak them aloud. Why him? Why risk everything? The Apache was kept in the barn at the edge of the settlement, watched by 2 men at all hours. They had not killed him, though many had wanted to. Some believed it was the only way to keep peace with neighboring villages, others said the land itself would curse them if they spilled blood so carelessly. Yet the choice to keep him alive was not one made easily. Every evening, men gathered at the meeting hall, their voices rising as they argued what to do. Some called for justice, others for mercy, and still others for silence. The woman kept to herself during those nights, though her heart pulled her toward the barn. She had seen his eyes when he stood free. They had not been the eyes of a murderer or a savage as the others described him. They had been the eyes of a man, strong, but weary, proud but not cruel. And she could not forget the way he had pulled her to her feet, saving her even as she tried to save him. One night, when the stars hung like silver dust over the prairie, she walked toward the barn. Her footsteps were soft, careful not to draw the watchman's attention. She carried a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, her hands trembling as she approached. When she slipped inside, the shadows stretched long, the air heavy with the smell of hay and horses. The Apache sat in the corner, his hands bound loosely with new rope, though not as cruelly as before. His head lifted when she entered, his dark eyes locking on her. She placed the bread on the ground between them. Her voice shook when she spoke, barely above a whisper, "You must eat." He did not move at first. His gaze studied her, as though trying to understand what manner of woman would do what she had done. Slowly, carefully, he leaned forward and took the bread. His fingers brushed the cloth, calloused and rough, marked by years of struggle. He did not thank her with words, but his eyes softened, if only for a moment. She sat across from him, her back against the wooden wall, her hands resting on her belly. Silence filled the space, yet it was not an empty silence. It was a silence that carried weight, as though both of them understood something unspoken. She wanted to ask why he had been tied there, what he had done, what wrong had led to his capture. But she did not. She knew the walls had ears, and words had a way of twisting once they left the tongue. The days passed, and each night she found herself drawn back to the barn. Sometimes she brought bread, sometimes water, once even a blanket. Each time, the Apache's guarded eyes softened more. He did not speak often, though he would say a word or two in broken English. She listened closely, trying to catch meaning in the spaces between his words. She learned only fragments: his people's land taken, his family scattered, his capture unjust. Yet even those fragments were enough to deepen the unease in her heart. Outside the barn, the village grew restless. Rumors spread that the Apache's tribe was near, that they would come to free him or to take revenge. Men kept rifles close, women pulled their children indoors at night, and the air filled with fear. Some said the woman's kindness would bring ruin to them all. Some said the land itself was already watching, waiting for blood to be spilled. She felt the weight of their eyes on her wherever she went. Yet each time she thought of staying away, she remembered the moment in the corral. The dust in the air, the horns glinting in the light, the strength in his eyes as he tore free. That moment had changed something inside her, though she could not yet name it. The prairie nights grew colder, the wind sharper, carrying with it the cries of coyotes and the distant beat of drums. The men of the village sharpened their knives and loaded their rifles, whispering of what might come. The woman, though heavy with child, felt no rest. Each night she dreamed of the bull's charge, of the Apache's eyes, of a storm on the horizon. That seemed to draw nearer with each passing day. And in the heart of the barn, beneath the creak of wooden beams and the flicker of lantern light, the Apache waited. His silence was heavy, his presence unshaken, as though he knew something the rest of them did not. Something that would soon come to the village, whether they were ready or not. The woman pressed her hands against her belly, the weight of two lives pulling her between fear and courage. She could not know if she had saved a man that day in the corral, or if she had brought a greater danger upon them all. The truth hung over her like the prairie sky, vast and uncertain, ready to break open at any moment. The night after the bull stormed the corral, a hard wind pushed across the prairie and rattled the loose shingles on every roof. The village shutters banged, and lanterns swung on their hooks as if the whole row of cabins had a heartbeat. Inside, people spoke in low voices. Mothers drew water. Men counted cartridges and argued about duty and fear. The young woman sat by her small stove with a thin shawl around her shoulders, warming her hands and listening to the wind like it could answer every question she carried. The child inside her rolled once, a slow turn that felt like a nudge. She whispered a promise to keep them both safe, though she did not know how a promise could stand against a storm that had started far beyond the fences dotted the barn. 2 men kept watch on the Apache. One was a ranch hand with a scar on his cheek from a barbed wire scrape. The other was the blacksmith's boy, hardly more than 16, eager yet uneasy. The ranch hand muttered about tracks he had seen out near the creek. The boy said tracks could belong to anyone. The ranch hand called him foolish and spit into the hay. The Apache listened, his face unreadable in the half-light. He had been given a wool blanket and a tin cup of water. He did not ask for more. When the boy dozed, the Apache studied the rope knot at his wrists and the slant of the moon through the crack in the boards. He did not try to flee. He measured the hours and waited out the woman's visits became the quiet center of each day. She brought food she could spare and clean rags for his wrist burns. The first time she saw the marks, something inside her tightened. She held a damp cloth gently to the skin and tried not to wince at what the rope had done. He watched her hands like a man watching rain after a long dry spell. When she pulled the cloth away, he spoke a word in his language. It sounded like a thank you and a warning at the same time. She nodded as if she understood both. People saw her step into the barn. They talked. A preacher who came through once a month shook his head and told her neighbor that kindness should be given with wisdom, that mercy could bring danger if it walked alone. The neighbor repeated that sentence to anyone who would listen, though he forgot the part about mercy and kept the part about danger. Soon the story in the meeting hall changed shape. Some said the woman spared the Apache for reasons not decent. Others said the Apache had put a charm on her. The truth was smaller and heavier. She had seen a man about to die and had moved toward him. But the prairie made simple truths hard to carry. There were other pressures, too. Cattle strayed more often. A dry creek bed near the north line gave up a few old arrowheads, and the children turned them into prizes traded for sweets. A railroad agent rode into town with a stiff hat and a straight mouth. He spoke of a new spur line and fresh workers and money if the village cooperated. He also spoke of order. He said the governor cared about calm along the route. A rumor about unrest would sour the deal. He looked at the barn door when he said unrest. He looked at the meeting hall men as if he was weighing them and their patience. Across the fields, the land itself held the real argument. The fence where the Apache had been trapped stood on a swath of grazing ground that had once been a common path. The old hunters in the village knew this, though they did not admit it aloud. The path led between low hills past a stand of cottonwood, a place where buffalo once bedded in the heat. The new barbed wire ran across it like a scar. Some said the wire was progress. Some said progress came with a cost no one yet understood. One evening, the blacksmith's boy slipped into the barn while the ranch hand was at the end of the lane. He held a small tin harmonica and sat on an overturned bucket, not too close. He played a halting tune he had learned from his father before his father left on a long cattle drive. The Apache watched him with a patience that made the boy nervous. When the boy finished, the Apache touched his own chest and spoke a name. Then he touched the far wall and spoke another. The boy guessed the second was a place. He pointed north. The Apache did not nod. He looked at the floor and closed his eyes. The boy felt like he had stepped toward a door and found it, locked from the other side. That night the woman dreamed of the path between the hills. In the dream she walked there at dusk, holding her belly with both hands to steady herself. She saw deer tracks and a hawk feather caught in the brush. She also saw footprints that did not belong to cattle herders. They were light and sure and spread wide like a scouting pattern. She woke with her heart racing and the taste of dust in her mouth. There was no way to know if the dream drew from a fear or from a truth the wind had carried to her. The next afternoon she went to the midwife. At the end of the row of cabins, the midwife had kind eyes and a sharp tongue. She checked the woman's pulse and listened to the child. She said the child sat low but strong, that the time was still a little ways off. Then she leaned closer and asked what weighed on the woman's face. The woman spoke carefully. She said she had helped a man that others called an enemy, and now she did not know how to carry both compassion and caution in one set of arms. The midwife said a woman's arms had been doing that since the first cabin was nailed together in places like this. She also said the land kept its own memory, and sometimes the land pushed back when it was cut. Take care when the wind changes, she warned, and be near safe people when night falls. At the meeting hall, a new plan took shape. The men would ride out at dawn and check the far pasture, the creek bend, the broken cottonwood. They would leave a signal on a fence post if they saw signs of a camp. The ranch foreman, a square man who liked simple answers, said they should also send a message to the neighboring fort asking for a patrol. The schoolteacher said a patrol would make peace harder. The foreman said peace would come when folks knew their place. The schoolteacher shut his mouth, but his eyes stayed hard. He had traveled once to a larger town and had seen how quick words could fan fires. As word of the ride spread, the woman went again to the barn. She found the boy there and the Apache awake. She said quietly that men would ride out at dawn toward the cottonwood. The Apache's jaw tightened. He asked, with a few words and a gesture, if she had seen a trail. She told him only that the land to the north held old paths that did not welcome fences. He nodded once and stared at the door. She felt the urge to cut the rope at his wrists and tell him to take the dark as cover, yet she knew if the men found an empty stall in the morning, their fear would turn into something worse. Her child shifted again, as if reminding her that every choice carried two lives. The blacksmith's boy brought water and tried to lift the mood with a joke about the preacher's mule. The woman forced a smile. The Apache did not. He asked for a small favor instead. He pointed to the blanket and then to the floor near the back wall, where a narrow board sat loose. The woman knelt and pried it up. There was nothing there but a patch of hard earth. The Apache said a word that could have been hide. She understood that he was asking for a place to put something if a search came. She folded the blanket, slipped it under the board, and pressed the plank back into place. It was a small lie to an uncertain future. Dawn arrived pale and chill. The riders moved out. The foreman led, and the schoolteacher rode behind him with a thin face and a tight grip on his reins. The boy wished he could join, but the ranch hand told him to mind the barn. The woman watched from her door, a cup of hot water in her hands pretending to be coffee. She saw the line of men cross the ridge and drop out of sight. A lark rose and dipped in their wake. The wind shifted, coming from the north now, colder and sharper. By noon, the village felt like a clock wound too tight. The midwife went door to door with a basket of herbs, telling anyone who listened to gather their children before dark. The railroad agent measured the distance between the warehouse and the track bed as if paper contracts could quiet a worried heart. The preacher opened the meeting hall for prayer and found that only the boy came to sit in the benches. They did not pray loud. They listened, each in their own way, for hoofbeats coming back. When the riders returned, their faces told more than their words. They had found sign at the cottonwood, char marks on a stone, a scrap of leather with beadwork, a set of small prints near the creek that looked like a child's. No camp, no clear direction, just proof of nearby life. The foreman called it proof of a plan. The schoolteacher said it was a family passing through. The argument rose again. A patrol from the fort was sent for, despite half the room shaking their heads. That night, the woman dreamed once more of the path, but now lightning forked in the distance. She woke to a sound that was not thunder. It was a whistle. Short and low. Another answered it from the east. She sat up and held her breath. It came again, this time closer. Her first thought was that the riders had staged a call. Then she realized the notes were not the same as the ones the men used. These were lighter, like a bird signaling to its mate. She stood and pulled on her shawl. The child inside her pressed against her ribs as if leaning to listen too. She made her way to the barn. The boy was awake, eyes wide, hand on a small knife he had no intention of using. He said he had heard the whistles and had barred the door. The ranch hand was nowhere in sight. The woman looked at the Apache. He was alert, head tilted to the side. He told the boy in slow words to lower the lantern. The boy obeyed. The barn dimmed to a bruise-colored glow. A figure moved at the crack beneath the main door. Then a second. No one spoke. The woman's heart beat hard enough to make her feel dizzy. A small hand slid under the door and tapped twice. The Apache answered with 2 taps on the floorboard. The hand withdrew. The woman looked at the boy. He looked back, pale as chalk. The Apache nodded toward the loose board at the back wall and then toward the door ropes. He did not ask to be freed. He asked to be ready. The boy swallowed and moved to the board, lifting it just enough to reach the blanket. He kept his body between the plank and the door in case a watchful eye peered through the cracks. The woman stood still, her breath small and quick. She could smell rain somewhere miles off, carried thin on the wind. Outside, hoofbeats sounded. At a distance, not from the ridge but from the east. The 2 figures at the door stilled, then melted into the shadow of the lean-to. The hoofbeats grew louder. The woman recognized the foreman's bark before she saw the lantern he carried. Men crowded behind him with rifles held high. He shouted for the barn to be opened, said he had word of movement near the fields. The boy slid the board back into place with a soft scrape that seemed loud as a shout. He lifted the door bar with shaking hands. The foreman pushed in with his lantern held out like a judgment. His eyes swept the stalls and landed on the Apache. He looked at the rope at the wrists and then at the woman. He asked why the lantern had been lowered. The boy said the flame had dropped on its own. The foreman did not believe him, but he chose a bigger target. He told the woman that kindness had rules and that she had stepped past them. He leaned closer and said the patrol would arrive by dawn. The Apache would be transferred to the fort. After that, there would be no more visits and no more debate. The foreman's eyes shone with the relief of a man who thought a problem could be boxed and moved out of sight. When the men left, the barn settled into a heavy quiet. The woman felt the child shift again and placed a hand there to soothe the pressure. The boy sat down hard on the bucket, breathing fast. The Apache watched the door where the figures had first appeared. He said in a low voice that was almost a breath that dawn would bring more than soldiers. He pointed at the ground, then at the north. His meaning was clear. Others were already near. The woman understood the shape of what he was telling her, but the scale of it was hard to hold. She thought of the midwife's warning about the wind changing. She thought of the railroad agent and his quiet talk of order. She thought of the arrows found in the dry creek and the old path cut by new wire. It felt as if every choice anyone had made on this land had been leading to a single narrow place, where there would not be enough room for all of them to pass at once. She left the barn close to midnight. The sky had cleared, and a scatter of stars lit the dry grass with a pale shine. As she walked, she saw a shape near her doorway and froze. It was not a man. It was a bundle propped against her step, tied with a strip of leather. She lifted it with careful hands and carried it inside. On her table, she untied the leather and peeled back cloth. Inside lay a small pouch of crushed sage, a smooth river stone painted with a thin white line, and a length of woven cord with a pattern she recognized from the bead scrap found by the writers. There was also a short stick wrapped in horsehair. None of it felt like a warning. It felt like a message sent to someone who had listened. She drew the bolt on her door and sat in the half-dark with the bundle before her. The child turned once more. She thought of the hand beneath the barn door and the two soft taps. She thought of dawn bringing riders from two directions. She wondered what the first sound would be when the light came. A patrol trumpet. A call from the north shapes. A scream. A prayer. She could not know. She could only choose where to stand when it started. She packed the bundle back into the cloth and tied it again with the leather. Then she set it by her door, ready to carry. The wind changed and carried a faint rhythm from the hills, like steps in dry grass. She closed her eyes and listened. Morning waited on the edge of the world, and the village waited with it, caught between duty and fear and the pull of old paths that would not be forgotten. The first light crept over the ridge like a thin blade cutting through the mist that clung to the low fields. The woman stood at her doorway with the bundle close at her feet, her shawl pulled tight, her breath a faint cloud in the cold. Every sound felt sharper in that hour. The creak of a barn hinge, the scrape of boots on frozen earth, even the restless cry of a crow seemed to echo longer than it should. She kept one hand pressed against her belly, feeling the child shift in slow waves, as though even the unborn knew the land was waiting for something heavy to break. The patrol had not yet arrived, though the foreman had promised it would. Instead, it was the village men who gathered first, rifles across their backs, voices clipped and tense. They did not laugh or argue as they had the day before. They spoke only in fragments, short words carried by the wind, sharp as stones. Woman watched them ride out again toward the north fields, their horses stamping clouds of dirt and frost. Behind them, the schoolteacher lingered, his face pale, his hands tight around the reins. He looked back once at the woman's door before following inside the barn. The Apache sat upright, his eyes alert, his body rigid with quiet strength. The boy had stayed awake most of the night, knife still tucked at his side, though his hands trembled when he held the lantern. The woman stepped inside and found them both silent. She set the bundle near the stall and told them of the riders heading north. The Apache nodded once. His gaze moved to the crack in the boards where a thin line of daylight crept in. His expression carried no fear, only a readiness that unsettled her more than if he had shouted. The captain barked an order. Two soldiers moved to the door, rifles ready. They swung it open. The cold wind rushed inside, carrying dust and the scent of rain. Beyond the doorway, under the dimming sky, riders stood still on their horses. Their faces were painted, their eyes sharp, their silhouettes fierce against the storm clouds. They did not raise their weapons. They only watched. The woman felt her knees weaken again, but she stayed upright, clutching her shawl around her. The boy pressed close to her side, his small fingers digging into her arm. The villagers gasped softly, but none moved closer. The air between those inside and those outside held a weight thicker than words. One rider dismounted, slow and steady, his movements calm, deliberate. He stepped into the light of the hall's doorway. His gaze swept over the soldiers, the villagers, the railroad agent shrinking into the corner, the foreman with his fists balled at his sides. Finally, his eyes settled on the Apache prisoner. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that ran deeper than language. The writer spoke, his voice low but clear. He said they had come for their brother. He said they wanted no blood, no fire, only his release. The hall fell silent. The foreman shouted that giving him up would mean surrender, weakness, the end of progress. He demanded the captain refuse. But the words hung empty, falling heavy on ears already tired of fear. The captain looked at his men, then at the villagers. He saw the mothers clutching children, the men shifting uncomfortably, the midwife standing firm with her arms crossed. He looked again at the Apache, standing tall despite his chains. The captain's voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected. He asked what would happen if he was freed. The writer answered simply, they would take their brother and leave. The storm would pass without fire. No one else needed to suffer. The words carried a weight that silenced the foreman's protests. Even the railroad agent could not speak. The boy tugged at the woman's shawl, whispering that it was the only way. She nodded faintly, her eyes locked on the Apache. The captain gave a slow order. The chains were unfastened. The iron fell to the floor with a dull clatter. The Apache rubbed his wrists once, then lifted his head. He did not run. He did not gloat. He walked with measured steps toward the doorway, toward the writer waiting outside. Before leaving, he turned his head just slightly, his gaze resting on the woman. In that glance was gratitude, silent and deep, and perhaps also a promise that her courage would not be forgotten. The villagers held their breath as the Apache stepped into the night. The writer placed a hand on his shoulder. Together they mounted the horse and rode back toward the line of waiting figures. Without a word, the riders turned, guiding their horses away from the village. The hoofbeats faded into the dark horizon. The whistles ceased. The wind carried only the soft patter of the coming rain. Inside the hall, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, but not with fear. It was the silence of something released, something that had nearly broken, but instead had bent and passed. The foreman muttered curses under his breath, but his voice no longer carried power. The railroad agent gathered his papers, his face pale, his promises sounding brittle even before he spoke them. The captain finally lowered his hand, signaling his men to stand down. The woman walked home with the boy beside her. Her steps were slow, but she felt lighter than she had in days. At her door, she found the bundle still waiting on her table. She looked at the sage, the woven cord, the stone, the horsehair. She understood now that it had not been a warning of fear, but a message of connection, a reminder that lives tied to the land could not be severed by fences or contracts. She tucked the pieces into a small wooden box, sealing them like keepsakes to remind her child one day of the night when silence carried more power than rifles. That evening, the midwife came to sit with her. They drank warm broth while the boy drifted to sleep near the hearth. The midwife told her that storms came in many shapes, some with thunder, some with men shouting, some with the quiet weight of choices. She said the woman had faced all three and still stood. She said the child would know strength because the mother had carried it through fire and fear. In the days that followed, the soldiers left. The railroad agent moved on to other towns, chasing deals and contracts that sounded thinner with each retelling. The foreman remained bitter, but his words found fewer ears willing to listen. The villagers carried on with their fields and fences, but something had shifted. They spoke less quickly of enemies, more quietly of neighbors. They remembered that peace was not built with iron alone. When the woman's time finally came, the midwife was at her side, the boy waiting just outside the door with water and cloths. The birth was long, but when it was done, the cry of new life filled the small room. The woman wept as she held the child, not only from pain but from relief. from the knowledge that the world had not torn itself apart before this moment. She whispered a soft promise that the child would grow knowing both strength and compassion, both courage and listening. Seasons turned. The land bore new harvests, the fences stood though some sagged, and the paths through the hills still carried the faint prints of horses long past. The boy grew taller, his hands steadier, his heart softer for having lived through a night when the whole world seemed to tremble. The child grew too, laughing in the fields, listening to stories told by firelight. The woman carried on, her body marked by hardship, her spirit steady. Sometimes, in the stillness of evening, she thought of the Apache. She wondered where his path had led, whether he remembered the woman who risked herself when the world closed in. She wondered if he carried the memory of the boy's lantern, the warmth of kindness found in an unexpected place. She would never know for certain, but she knew that his gaze, steady and sure, had changed her life as much as her act had changed his. The villagers rarely spoke of that night in full. They said only that a storm came and passed, that no blood fell, that something larger than fear had carried them through. They remembered the silence more than the shouts, the glances more than the rifles. They remembered the courage of a woman heavy with child, standing firm when others shook. And so the story lived, carried in whispers, in glances between neighbors, in the quiet lessons parents passed to children. That sometimes the greatest strength lay not in holding tighter, but in letting go. That sometimes peace could be chosen, even when war seemed certain. That the bond between people, even strangers, could be stronger than iron, stronger than fear. As the years stretched on, the woman sat often by her doorway, watching the horizon shift with light and shadow. She held her child close, listening to the heartbeat against her chest, and thought of all that had come and gone. She felt the land breathe around her, endless, carrying both scars and beauty. She knew the village would go on, that fences would rise and fall, that storms would come again. But she also knew that one night, when the world nearly broke, compassion had been enough to hold it together, and that, she thought, was something worth carrying forward, something worth leaving behind. When her own story reached its end, the boy asked what would happen when the patrol from the fort arrived. His voice cracked, still carrying the tone of a youth not ready for such weight. The woman answered with honesty. She said the patrol would take the Apache away, but she did not know if that meant safety or chains. She added softly that men often mistook control for peace, and peace rarely followed. The boy lowered his head. He said he wished he had not played the harmonica that night, as if even that small act of kindness had tied him to a fate too large. By midday, the railroad agent stood in the meeting hall again, papers spread across the table, promising progress if the village proved it could keep its ground. He warned that delays and unrest would sour the deal. His voice was smooth, but his eyes betrayed a nervous flick toward the windows each time a gust rattled the panes. He wanted the patrol to handle things swiftly, to box the problem and roll it away on a wagon. Yet outside, the land stretched, endless, unconcerned with contracts or signatures, holding its own silence that seemed to grow heavier by the hour. The woman returned home and found the bundle still waiting by her door. She lifted it again and set it on her table, untying the leather with slow fingers. The stone, the sage, the woven cord, the horsehair. She studied each piece, searching for meaning. Perhaps they were gifts, perhaps signs of kin close by. She thought of the small hand that had tapped beneath the barn door. That memory pulsed in her mind stronger than the words of the foreman or the agent. It told her the Apache was not alone, and that the village was closer to fire than anyone dared admit. The midwife arrived just as the wind shifted again, sharper now, carrying the smell of rain mixed with smoke. She looked at the bundle on the table and frowned, her lips pressing thin. She told the woman that some messages were not meant for everyone to see, but since the woman had been chosen, she must treat it with care. She warned her again to stay close to safe people, to guard her strength, for her time was drawing near. Then the midwife added something else, her voice quiet. She said the world did not always split into enemy and friend. Sometimes it split into those who listened and those who closed their ears. By late afternoon, the patrol finally arrived. Dust rose in long trails as soldiers in blue rode into the village, their sabers flashing in the light, their faces stern. Children peered from behind doorways. Men tightened their grips on rifles. The foreman greeted the captain like salvation had stepped off the road. He pointed toward the barn. The captain nodded once, his jaw stiff, and ordered 2 men to dismount. The woman stood at her own doorway and felt her knees weaken. She thought of running to the barn, but the child inside her pressed hard, and she knew she could not move fast enough. In the barn, the boy saw them coming before the door opened. He whispered to the Apache that soldiers were here. The Apache did not move, though his eyes darkened, his breath slower but deeper. He said nothing, only glanced at the loose board where the blanket and the hidden bundle rested. The boy swallowed hard. When the soldiers opened the door, the lantern light fell across the Apache's face, and the barn filled with the sound of boots and iron. The captain entered with the foreman at his side. He looked at the prisoner as one might look at an object already claimed. He gave orders for chains and for the rope to be cut. The boy stepped back, knife trembling in his grip, then hid it behind his back when the foreman's gaze swept over him. The woman, standing just outside, heard every word, but dared not step in. She gripped the doorframe until her knuckles ached. The soldiers chained the Apache, his wrists pulled forward, iron biting where rope had already scarred. He stood tall despite it, his eyes meeting the woman's through the open gap. In that brief moment, she saw no plea, no anger, only a deep steadiness that told her the story was not ending here. The boy saw it too and felt his chest tighten. He wanted to shout, to argue, to explain that this man had not raised a hand against them, but his voice caught in his throat. The captain ordered the Apache to be taken to the meeting hall first, before transport. He wanted witnesses, proof of order, proof of control. The villagers gathered, whispering and shifting as the prisoner was led through the dirt street. Some children clung to their mothers. Men watched with a mixture of relief and unease. The woman walked slowly behind the line, her steps heavy, her shawl slipping from one shoulder. She could not look away. Inside the hall, the captain spoke of duty, of safety, of progress. He promised the railroad would come, the village would thrive, and peace would return. His words sounded practiced, hollow, carried by the echo of boots. On the floor, the Apache stood silent, chains at his wrists, watching the faces of the crowd. The woman noticed how his gaze lingered on the schoolteacher, then on the boy, then on her. He was measuring, she realized, not pleading. Measuring who might still listen. Outside, the wind rose. The sky darkened, clouds gathering in a low, heavy ceiling. Then came the sound that broke every whispered prayer. A whistle. Short, sharp, from the north. Another answered from the east. The villagers froze. The soldiers stiffened, hands on rifles. The foreman swore under his breath. The woman felt her heart seize, the bundle on her table flashing in her memory. She knew those whistles were the same as the ones from the night before. The captain barked orders, sending men to the doors and windows. He demanded to know what signals were being made, but no one in the hall answered. The boy looked at the woman, his face pale, his lips trembling. She could not speak. She knew the whistles meant others were near, perhaps already surrounding the village. The Apache closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, calm even with iron biting his wrists. His silence was louder than the captain's shouts. Thunder rolled across the horizon, but it was not thunder alone. Hoofbeats pounded the earth beyond the ridge, distant but growing. The sound spread like a storm, rolling toward the village, steady, relentless. Every child clutched tighter to their mother. Every man reached for his rifle. The woman pressed her hand hard against her belly, whispering to the child to hold steady. The captain shouted for barricades, for every able man to take position. The railroad agent begged for calm, saying panic would ruin everything. The foreman demanded the prisoner be taken at once, moved before the storm broke over them. But the soldiers hesitated, glancing between the captain, the foreman, and the dark windows where the whistles still echoed. The boy slipped close to the woman, his voice barely more than a breath. He asked if this was the moment when everything would break. She could not answer. She only looked at the Apache, who now stood straighter despite the chains, his eyes fixed on the door. He seemed to be waiting, not for rescue, not for mercy, but for the truth to arrive, whatever form it took. The hoofbeats grew louder, shaking the ground beneath the hall. The dust drifted from the rafters. The villagers clung to each other, torn between fear of what was coming and fear of what they had already done. The woman felt her strength falter, yet she stood, unwilling to sit when the storm finally came. The child within her turned again, as if answering the rhythm outside. She whispered one word under her breath, though she did not know if it was a prayer, a plea, or a promise. The door rattled under the force of the wind. The captain raised his hand to signal his men. The foreman shouted again. The boy gripped her arm. The woman's heart pounded like a drum. Outside, the hoofbeats thundered closer, and the whistles cut sharp through the air. The moment hung suspended, every breath caught. Every choice pressed into silence. And then the first knock struck the door. Firm and certain, like the opening note of a song that no one yet knew how it would end. The heavy knock on the door echoed through the hall like a drumbeat no one could ignore. Every head turned toward it, every breath caught tight and waiting. The captain motioned for silence, his jaw clenched so hard his cheek twitched. The soldiers raised their rifles, forming a line against the wooden frame. The villagers held still, their whispers dying into the crackle of the lanterns. Outside, the hoofbeats slowed, circling the hall in wide arcs. Then another knock came, slower this time, deliberate. The sound rattled more than the walls. It rattled the hearts of everyone who heard it. The foreman stepped forward, his voice sharp with fear disguised as command. He told the captain to open the door, to show strength, to prove they could not be rattled by shadows. The captain hesitated, glancing at his men, then at the prisoner bound in chains. The Apache stood still, eyes fixed on the door, shoulders straight. He did not flinch when the iron bit deeper into his wrists. He looked like he had been waiting his entire life for this moment.